Now on Atlanta News First, this is Campaign 2024 special coverage.
And thank you for joining us back here on Atlanta News First. I am Maria Moreau, joined by the one and only Tim Darnell, our Atlanta News First digital producer of Investigate. Tim, you are also our newsroom political mind, as well as many of our hardworking anchors and reporters here. So I wanted to bring you on to talk about some of the different things that we've been watching with polling locations, with really the developments that we've seen play out from the Secretary of State's remarks, all the way to some updates we heard from our reporters out in the Georgia Election Center. What have you been following?
Well, Maria, we've been following really a lot of the astonishing early voting numbers that have already been recorded here in Georgia. Historically high number of early votes have already been turned in. Obviously, we can no longer do that now that polls are open throughout the state, in-person polling. But it's really a testament to Georgia's organized absentee and early voting system, a system that came under fire, really within the past 4 years for allegedly attempting or accusations from underserved communities or progressive organizations representing minority voters that the state's Republican hierarchy was attempting to really suppress the minority vote and discourage voting. And yet, over the past 2 to 3 elections, we've seen, really in the last 2 electoral cycles, 2022, 2024, we have shattered early voting records here throughout the state. That's going to play a major role throughout the rest of the day because, as we've heard from Secretary of State Brad Raffensberger, he is anticipating that before the night is over, we will know whether or not Democratic Vice President Kamala Harris or Republican former President Donald Trump will have carried Georgia, one of the most important battleground states in the nation, one of about 7 states where we can confidently say the 47th President of the United States will be decided. Here in Georgia, North Carolina, 5 other western states, central states throughout the central, mountain, and western time zones. We'll see those polls close later this evening. We do know that most polls throughout Georgia will close at 7 p.m., with the exception of a couple who have been ordered to stay open past 7 p.m. I believe most of those are headquartered in Cobb County. As I recall, 2 precincts have been ordered to remain open because of administrative or technical or clerical issues. But overall, Secretary of State Brad Raffensberger is saying that we are seeing a very, very organized, very healthy turnout, and perhaps a little over 1 million voters in Georgia will cast their ballots today in an election that is unprecedented in its historical nature.
And I'm glad you bring up the Secretary of State. We are moments away from hearing his afternoon update regarding how elections are going here in Georgia, how polling places are operating. This is of any day, this is his day to make sure that he is ensuring a smooth and safe election process for those that are casting their ballots up until that 7 o'clock mark, and those in line that will be casting it even a couple minutes after 7. We are focusing minute by minute on every development that's been going on leading up to tonight. But the big fascination for so many people, as much as we get excited over the local races that are happening here, this is the 2024 presidential elections, and Georgia is a swing state this time around. So the campaigns have been focusing on getting Georgia votes all the way up until just being here yesterday. Supporters and folks that are campaigning for former President Donald Trump, campaigning for Vice President Kamala Harris, showing up, rallying the supporters, getting them to go out and cast their ballot right here in the Peach State because they know how consequential it'll be to get to 270.
Georgia is a battleground state, and let's delve into a little bit as we're waiting to hear the latest update from Secretary of State Brad Raffensberger. This is his day, as you said. He has been rumored to be a gubernatorial candidate in 2 years. We're looking at 2026. Governor Brian Kemp constitutionally prohibited from seeking a third consecutive term. It will be a wide open seat. Brad Raffensberger, Lieutenant Governor Burt Jones, Attorney General Chris Carr, several others have been rumored to be possible Republican gubernatorial contenders. But going back to 2020, Democrat Joe Biden became the first Democrat to carry Georgia or any deep southern state since 1992, when Arkansas Governor Bill Clinton carried Georgia on his way to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. Since then, Georgia has been solidly Republican. But in 2020, Joe Biden defeated Donald Trump by really less than 17,000 votes here in Georgia. He won the state by 0.2%. That was the narrowest margin that Joe Biden carried in defeating Donald Trump in any state throughout the U.S. in 2020. That's the reason Georgia is a battleground state. It has been solidly Republican in every presidential election until 4 years ago. And now Georgia and North Carolina, the only two deep southern states that are south of the Mason-Dixon line, so to speak, if we still use that phrase here in the 21st century, that are really battleground states, along with Arizona, Nevada, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan, those so-called blue wall states. But that's why so much attention has been focused. Kamala Harris has been here more than at least half a dozen times. So has Donald Trump. J.D. Vance was in Atlanta Monday night. Tim Walz, his wife, the First Lady of Minnesota, Gwen Walz, First Lady Jill Biden, I should say, was here in Atlanta and Georgia within the last several days as we've seen the end of the 2024 election.
Yeah, certainly. There's actually a lot that can be said by looking at the past. You can better prepare for the future. I actually spoke with a historian that worked with the George W. Bush administration, worked to prepare campaigns for debates and really speeches to voters to rally support and go out and vote. That's the big thing that they need, is to energize folks regardless of which side, but their supporters, hopefully, to go out and cast their ballot, because that will make or break the difference. But the historian I spoke to, he echoed what you were saying about how we can look at past campaigns, how we can look at past electoral processes, and we can see patterns in that. We can't necessarily predict the outcome, but it's a lot to really unwrap when you start looking back, as we really take today and for what it is, as folks are casting their ballot, as everyone is turning on their TVs tonight and learning what the outcome of the next 4 years will be. So I do want to take you out to that interview as we spoke to a presidential historian on really the past 20 years of the presidential election campaigns. It's election day here in Georgia, and all eyes are on the 2024 presidential race between Vice President Kamala Harris and former President Donald Trump. That has already been seen as an unprecedented number of registered voters have cast their ballot before official November 5th election day. Now, former President Trump is running to reclaim the Oval Office he lost to Democrat Joe Biden 4 years ago. If he wins, he will become the first former president to reclaim the White House since 19th century Democrat Grover Cleveland, along with becoming the first formerly twice impeached president and the first ever convicted felon elected president. Now, on the other hand, Harris is also seeking to make history by becoming the first woman and woman of color ever elected president. If she wins, Harris will also become the first major political party's nominee ever elected to the White House who has never won any of her party's state primary elections. The outcome of this race will be significant, to say the least, and no one better to help me underscore that than presidential historian and former Deputy Secretary of Health and Human Services, Tevi Troy. Mr. Troy, thank you so much for joining us here. You yourself have worked to prepare candidates running in presidential races on the debate stage and elsewhere, and now you are giving this context that so many voters are trying to wrap their heads around as they proceed to cast their ballot. Talk to me a little bit about your background to get our viewers familiar with you.
Sure. I'm a presidential historian by training. I've written 5 books on the presidency, but I also, as you said, worked in the White House at the highest levels. I had a West Wing office in the George W. Bush White House. I've also worked on the Romney campaign, the Romney transition. I did debate prep in the Bush years, so I have a lot of experience in working in politics and in the White House, but I also have that academic training. You can see behind me some of the books I've written on the presidency.
Talk to me about what you've seen over this past year, really since these campaigns have launched, and as we've started to see the Trump and Harris campaigns work to earn votes and work to energize supporters in the final days of early voting, and now here on Election Day. What stands out to you?
Well, it's interesting that both candidates are coming from the White House. Both have been in the White House, either serving as vice president or as president, and both are claiming to create change. It's a change election. The American people are unhappy with where we are. There's a lot of wars around the world. There's inflation. The economy is poor. There's just a sense that things aren't going well. And so both candidates say, elect me and things are going to be different. But the people can rightly say to Harris, well, you're in the White House right now. And they could say to Trump, well, you've been in the White House before. So it's a weird election in that both candidates are running on change, but they also, in some ways, are part of the status quo.
Are there any comparisons that you have seen with past presidential campaigns into how this one is playing out?
Yeah, I see a couple. First of all, you obviously mentioned the Grover Cleveland, Benjamin Harrison, where Grover Cleveland returns to the White House. But I see some more recent examples that may be more relatable to people. So I think, first of all, in 1960, Richard Nixon loses in his race for re-election, his race for election. He's the vice president to Eisenhower. But then in 68, he runs again. And so he has a lot of grievances. He's unhappy with the way the media treated him. He thinks he was cheated in the 1960 election. And he's running against the sitting vice president, Hubert Humphrey. And again, it's a time of great tumult in America. There's protests, and the war in Vietnam is raging, and LBJ, Lyndon Johnson, is unpopular. And Nixon wins a squeaker against Hubert Humphrey, who is kind of like in the situation that Harris is now, where she is part of the administration, but also unhappy with parts of the administration. And it's a question of how much she can say that she's unhappy with the administration while still being loyal to the president in which she serves. This was the situation that Humphrey was, and he lost a very, very close election to Nixon. There was a 1-point differential in the popular vote. The other example I would think of is 2000, when George W. Bush, who had never served in the White House, but of course his father had served in the White House and lost to Bill Clinton in 1992, Bush is running for president against Al Gore, who's the sitting vice president. And Gore has a similar problem about how to deal with the presidency, although Clinton is personally popular, but Gore is backing away from him because of the Monica Lewinsky scandal. And Clinton is kind of put out that Gore doesn't take more advantage of Clinton on the campaign trail. And so that tension between the president and the vice president, if the vice president is running while there's a sitting president there for which the person served, that tension has been a problem for multiple vice presidents who've tried to make it through the big office.
Stepping outside of the presidential race, there has been a lot of talk about election security. Take me through the past 20 years. Have we seen improvements with the way that voters go to polls and cast their ballots?
I think there are some improvements. Florida, I think, is doing a much better job. Remember 2000, we talked about the race with Gore and Bush and how Florida was kind of a mess. Now they get all their votes counted on time. People are comfortable with the system. But I think there's this back and forth between the Democrats and the Republicans. The Republicans want to have ballot security measures. They want to have voter ID, which 80% of the Americans seem to support. But the Democrats are uncomfortable with these voter security measures, and they claim that there's no fraud. It's not true that there's no fraud, but there's a relatively small amount of fraud. But I don't understand the argument for not having ballot security measures. What we want is a system where it's easy to vote and hard to cheat. And I think that would increase the confidence that the American people have in the system. Look, you go to an airport or any building or sometimes even a baseball game, you have to show your ID. And now You don't have to show your ID, and you can even be arrested for showing ID today. It just doesn't make sense to me, especially when 80% of the American people want to have their voter ID laws. I just think we should move to that. It's a pretty simple fix that the vast majority of Americans want, and I think would increase confidence in the system.
Yeah, as we're talking about the final hours to polls closing, election day, there are still so many people across the country that are casting their ballot. There's a saying, history repeats itself. Is there any part of that saying that applies here and should be in the mindset of voters as they head to the polls?
Oh, so much. I mean, you've got a president running again. You've got vice presidents running under a president they served for. You've got tumult in the country. It's replete with historical precedents, and that's one of the things I like to do in all my books. People say this is unprecedented, that's unprecedented. Well, I always go and find the historical precedents, and I think it's fun to do, and I think it gives us insight into how we're doing. Also, everybody says this is the most important election of our lifetime. If my side loses, democracy's over, all this stuff. I don't believe a word of it. America will be fine regardless of which candidate wins. I think one candidate might be better than the other, but that's always the case. The democracy is not going away, the republic's not going away, and I think we should kind of tamp down the crazy rhetoric a little bit.
I want to make sure that our viewers can connect with you and the wonderful work that you put out if they wanted to learn more about the history of presidential elections and really more of your analysis. What's the best way to find you?
Well, you can follow me on Twitter at TeviTroy, at TeviTroy, or you can go to my website, tevitroy.org. You can sign up for my mailing list. And I'm never shy. I always have a lot of commentary on presidential history, again, from the perspective of someone who studied the presidency as an academic, but also been there as a White House aide.
Well, we'll be fascinated to follow your analysis as polls close. Any final words to the voters that are still setting out to cast their ballot today?
Yeah, go out and vote, and then you may have a friend or a family member who voted differently from you. And if your side loses or your side wins, reach out to them and show that the bonds of friendship and the bonds of family are more important than any particular election.
TeviTroy, I really appreciate your time. And again, you can find more links to our presidential coverage on AtlantaNewsFirst.com. And now I want to bring in our Atlanta News First political reporter, Doug Reardon here. As we talked a moment ago with TeviTroy about presidential campaigns past, today we look to presidential hopefuls' future. So, Doug, I know you've been out there following this. Really, you have been a force since early voting began with navigating everybody through the races that we have here in Metro Atlanta and Georgia, and now to tonight, when all eyes will be on this presidential race. How's it going out there?
Waiting for the doors to open here at the Grand Hyatt in Buckhead, which is not exactly a surprising spot for this GOP watch party to be tonight. And I should remind folks that we are not just voting on the presidential election today. We're going to have results all the way up and down the ballot from some really important congressional races between a hand-picked Trump candidate here in the Metro Atlanta area, all the way down to district attorney for Fulton County, where we are right now. And of course, that has been one that people are watching quite closely as well. And so we are expecting to see just about everyone here from the GOP today who has been a supporter of former President Trump, whether that be congressional members, members of the GOP party, members of his own campaign, and a lot of surrogates, people like Kelly Loeffler, who has an office just down the street from here, who has been not only one of Donald Trump's biggest supporters in Georgia financially and in person, but probably across the entire country. When he has stayed here overnight, Trump, for rallies or whatever the case may be, maybe a fundraiser, he has typically stayed in Buckhead. So this place makes sense for this watch party tonight. I think Georgia is a very hard state to predict as far as who's going to win, and so we haven't been making any of those. Obviously, that's not what we do. But it's not a very difficult state to decipher when you look at these two candidates and what they would need to do in order to win. We've seen a lot of Trump rallies in rural areas. We went out to a J.D. Vance rally in Lindale, Georgia, but we've also seen Trump rally here in Atlanta, here across the state in Macon. He's held things down south in Savannah, and so what Trump needs to do to win is keep that rural support that he has, but also to chip away at some of these metro Atlanta counties that are typically very, very supportive of blue candidates, places like Cobb County, Gwinnett County, Fulton County, DeKalb. He doesn't even need to win them. He just needs to chip away enough support to win this state of Georgia. And so that's, I think, what we're going to be watching most closely here at the GOP Watch Party tonight is how is Trump doing in some of these metro, city, and suburban areas that typically go for Democrats. That's what happened in 2020. 2020 when we saw this huge boom of voting in Fulton County and a lot of blue support in places like Cobb and Gwinnett and DeKalb. And so that's where we're going to be turning our focus to tonight to see how Trump is doing in those areas. Of course, on the flip side, for Kamala Harris, I know that Patrick Quinn out at the Democratic Watch Party is going to be keeping a closer eye on this too. But she needs to continue to maintain her support in all those places I just mentioned while doing the opposite, chipping away at Trump's rural vote. And so, if she can hold on to the places that made Joe Biden president and win the state of Georgia back in 2020, places like DeKalb, places like Fulton County, and winning big in those areas, keeping the margins that she needs to keep, then she may just win the state. And then it becomes a matter of turnout for her. How many people are actually coming out to vote for Kamala Harris in places like Fulton County? So we're going to be keeping a very close eye on not only what the GOP numbers are looking like tonight, but also the Democrats, especially in some of these city areas in some area. We'll send it back to you for now, but we're going to head inside here, and I know we'll see you a little bit later on.
Doug, I appreciate it. Hey, before you go, we just wanted to check in with you. Have you heard from any of the representatives that you spoke to or those that will be attending this tonight about whether they expect those results for Georgia to come in before midnight?
No, we have no idea what could be going on as far as the returns go, but we of course know that over 4 million Georgians cast ballots early. 1 million more are expected to do so today. And what that means is the more votes that are cast early, those because of House Bill 202, which was passed in the wake of 2020, those are able to be processed and ready to be counted essentially tonight. All they have to do is be run through the tabulator, and that is not even close to the longest part of that process. And so I would think that with record number of early voting turnout, that we would see the results sooner rather than later, hopefully before midnight.
Tim Darnell back here with me. Tim, bear with me. I'm just switching the box. As we talk about some of the different sides of this, the presidential election. This is really the race that everybody across the nation has been waiting for, and we are just now in the final hours that folks can cast their ballot and make their voice heard before everyone really tunes in tonight.
Well, and we can't overstate the historic nature of what we're going to witness tonight. Either Donald Trump, who is already, recorded as the 45th president of the United States, will become, and as your excellent interview with Tammy Troy mentioned, will become, or could become, if he wins tonight, regardless of what happens in Georgia, the entire nation, if he will become the first president since the late 19th century to serve 2 non-consecutive terms. He would also, if he wins, would become the first convicted felon to ever become elected president, the first twice impeached former president to ever reclaim the office, and just a political comeback that could be unprecedented in American history, as Tammy Troy mentioned in your interview just a few moments ago. And one of the things that actually came to my mind was, if you're looking back throughout American history in terms of political comeback stories, this really is second only to Richard Nixon, who served for 8 years as vice president under President Dwight Eisenhower, ran for president as the GOP nominee in 1960, lost a very close election to Massachusetts U.S. Senator John F. Kennedy, ran for California governor 2 years later, lost in that election, and gave one of the most famous post-election press conferences in recent U.S. history, where he pretty much blamed the news media for bias and said, gentlemen, think how much you're going to be missing because you won't have Nixon to kick around anymore. Because, gentlemen, this is my final press conference. Only a few years later, coming back, securing the Republican nomination for president in 1968, and becoming president by defeating Vice President Hubert Humphrey, who was Lyndon Johnson's VP, for about 6.5 years under the Johnson administration. Nixon obviously would resign in disgrace in 1974, becoming the only president in U.S. history to resign. Donald Trump attempting a political comeback, as I said, unprecedented in U.S. history. On the other side of the coin, Vice President Kamala Harris, California Attorney General, California United States Senator, ran an unsuccessful campaign for president in 2020, did not win a single primary in the Democratic race to challenge then President Donald Trump in 2020. She withdrew from the primaries very early on. Joe Biden chose Kamala Harris to be his vice presidential running mate. The two of them would win a very narrow election. Later that year, she became the first female vice president, the first woman of color to serve as vice president, the first woman of color to serve higher than any elected office in the land in 2020. Now she's seeking to become, again, setting her own trailblazing path by becoming the 47th President of the United States. It's also kind of interesting to note that she would become, if she wins, the first president elected who never won a party primary, one of her own party's primaries. We all know that after the Joe Biden's debate performance here in Atlanta on CNN in late June led to weeks of speculation that he was being pressured by top Democratic National Committee leaders and House Speaker Emerita Nancy Pelosi, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer. Others perhaps were putting a lot of pressure on President Biden to withdraw after his debate performance. A lot of rumors regarding and speculation regarding his mental acuity and what have you. That eventually led to Biden's withdrawal or suspension of his reelection campaign in early July. The same day, Vice President Harris announced her candidacy, and within only a couple of days after that, after a survey of Democratic National Committee delegates, secured the Democratic nomination, never going through a primary process or even being victorious in any of her primaries in 2020 and none in 2024.
Well said. You really laid it all out there. Yeah, regardless of this outcome, I mean, somebody is making history tonight. And even if we don't learn the outcome tonight, once those results do come in, the certification process, we will have, on either side of the coin, a president like we've never seen before. And it's funny I say that because we have had both of these candidates already in the White House. So there's a great irony to wording it this way. We are just moments away from hearing the Secretary of State. You can hear some of that chatter in the background as journalists get set up to hear those remarks. Again, the Secretary of State has been keeping tabs on how polling is going. He gave us an update earlier this morning to talk about election security, to talk about how the ballot and polling processes are going. And I know earlier we reported here on Atlanta News First about some threats that were circulating online. So the Secretary of State hopefully going to be addressing those here in the next couple minutes. This news conference was called for 2:30. We are currently at 2:28. So as soon as those remarks begin, we're going to take you out live to that. But Tim, I mean, from Georgia's standpoint, Georgia is playing a massive role here, both in the presidential race on local levels. It is one of the swing states that both campaigns are fighting over, and we saw that play out with the campaigns even up to yesterday when they showed up to rallies, showed up to energize supporters to cast their ballots today.
It is, and going back to the issue, Maria, of election security, on AtlantaNewsFirst.com we have a live blog going where our outstanding staff of experienced journalists here in the Atlanta News First newsroom and the First Alert Desk is bringing all of our readers and viewers the latest news and information. I will say earlier this morning we posted a letter that have been signed by not only Georgia Attorney General Chris Carr, but the other 49 attorneys generals throughout the United States, condemning political violence and asking everyone to really respect the American experiment in the democratic republic that we are in, that we've been at for almost 250 years, and to accept the election results, refrain from accepting political disinformation. Secretary of State Raffensberger spoke about that earlier this morning, where he attributed a couple of election poll threats to be attributable to Russian influence. We don't know about that, but we obviously Secretary of State is on top of this situation. But in terms of election security, I would just encourage everyone to follow our live blog, Campaign 2024, on the homepage and our #1 slot on AtlantaNewsFirst.com, and follow along, as Georgia will play a key role. We say a lot of times in our political update podcasts that are on YouTube and on your favorite podcasting platform, be it Spotify, Amazon, Apple Music, that Georgia is the nation's preeminent political battleground state, all of which makes it more imperative than ever that everyone in Georgia, a registered voter, exercises that sacred constitutional right that we have and that we enjoy, that is so infrequently found through nations throughout the world, to exercise that democratic right and head to the polls and make your voices count.
So let me ask you this, Tim. You have followed major races here in Georgia. You are a longtime Georgia journalist, and you have yourself seen presidential campaigns play out, have seen the fight over swing states like ours. What has captivated you the most following this presidential election?
What fascinates me the most, Maria, is that for the first time in a generation, we have two states in the Deep South that are swing states. When was the last time we could say that if a presidential candidate wins Georgia and North Carolina and a handful of the so-called Rust Belt states in the northern central Midwest, as well as Arizona and Nevada, that these states can swing a presidential election? When was the last time we could say that the road to the Oval Office, the road to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, the road to the office of the most powerful elected official in the world lies in the hands of voters in this magnificent state that we all love and that we call home, known as Georgia, the Peach State? That, to me, is the most inspiring and the most fascinating aspect of all of this, that Georgia has really claimed its spot, regardless of the reasons, regardless of how contested the election was in 2020 and the events that came after it, that succeeded it, that Georgia really has claimed its rightful place as the nation's preeminent political battleground state.
Perfectly said. I want to take folks back out live here as we wait moments from now to hear remarks from the Secretary of State. We have been told that there is a 2-minute warning that the Secretary of State will be making his way to this podium and giving his afternoon election update, talking about election security, talking about how the polling locations are performing, not performing, but how things are going across Metro Atlanta and Georgia. This is really the day for Brad Raffensberger to come forward in front of the people and really reassure folks every step of the way that whether they are casting their ballot tonight, whether they have already voted as part of the historic early voting records that we saw play out here in Georgia, that their election, their ballot is secure and will be carried out, will be counted. Now, one of the big things I wanted to ask you, Tim, and we asked this of Doug, was the statement that the Secretary of State made regarding how quickly we could expect Georgia's numbers to come in after polls close.
That is very interesting, Maria, and as we were talking earlier this morning, one of the things that I'm really interested in seeing tonight, first of all, we can attribute these supposed election.
And Tim, I do just want to interrupt you. We'll pick that conversation back up, but right now, the Secretary of State.
Calm y'all down, so things good, and things are really good. You should be excited if you live in Georgia. I know we have some maybe out-of-state press, but it's just exciting. Really, the big news today is we have over 700,000 Georgians who have already voted today. Just kind of prorate that out to the rest of the day. That'd be over 1.1 million, which gets us to probably right now 5,150,000. Now, we don't know if that trend will continue. We don't know if it'll actually come up a little bit. People get off work today. But that's really what the big news should be. Now, I'm not telling you what to print or write. That's your job. But I think that's pretty darn awesome. Then we have a few things that happen you just can't, explain. And one of them, you're in the weeds, but in Peach County this morning, it was a little cold down there. So someone plugged in the space heater that was also serving the county EMS for the election management system. And so it fried that, so it was replaced this morning. But those are the kind of things you just kind of don't expect. But very minor issue. And another really minor issue that so far 2 precincts in Cobb, had a late opening for about 30 minutes each, so they'll extend those. But what's really interesting is that today a lot of people call our call center. So far we've had 1,374 calls on our call center, and they were answered an average of 16 seconds, and the oldest was about 42 seconds. So really responsive, getting back to people, answering their questions. What do they do? Where do they go? Things like that. And then we've actually even gotten some great feedback. Already 40 emails. Instead of being dog-cussed, 40 emails telling us they had a great experience. We want everyone in Georgia to know that I've led on making sure that we lead the nation on having fast, secure, and accurate elections. And when you say fast, so much of that is about the voter experience, the customer, which is the voter today. And we're just really grateful we're getting feedback, but we're so grateful that we're having a check-in time right now under a minute. And we're having line time 2 to 3 minutes. So in 4 minutes or less, average, people are voting in Georgia. And we think that's good news too. So we have a lot to be proud of, and that's what you all have to be proud of, that you live in a great state. Now, I talked to you a little bit earlier about that Russian hoax and that bomb scare. And I just want to make sure everyone understands this, that Georgia's not going to be intimidated. Russia has just decided they picked on the wrong Georgia. They need to pick on the other one in the Black Sea, because we're not going to be intimidated. But we're just excited about where we are right now. I didn't know if anyone had any questions.
You talked about some precincts in Cobb County that'll be held open late. Are you aware of others? And also Cobb County said equipment issues were the reason for it. I don't know what equipment issues those are. Do you know?
No, it wasn't issues. It was just little things. Sometimes people forget keys. Sometimes they don't bring the power cord or connection, things like that. But it's just minor issues. But it's just 2 in Cobb. And there's a few other precincts where they had some of those bomb, the calls for the bomb scares. Sometimes most of the precincts, they just kept on voting. But in a few areas, they just paused while they did a check. And so like a 30-minute, 40-minute kind of wait for there. Not very many. So I think we're right now looking at less than a dozen across the entire state, out of 2,325, I believe it is. So it's, but it's just one of those inconveniences. But, I've said my piece. Obviously, you can see I'm pro-Georgia.
Good. And that Peach County issue, will that cause any delays or does that
No.
affect voters at all?
No, not at all. Didn't affect them at all.
Looks like you have large numbers voting early. These day of numbers are going to be a lot smaller. Do you have an idea, with those early votes, we're going to get a lot of numbers really soon. Talk about that and how we're going to see a lot of the results in this election you're hoping pretty early.
Absolutely. With SB 189 that we just passed this session, all the early votes that we have for the early voting in person and all the absentees that have come in early and have been accepted, all that has to be uploaded 1 hour after the polls close. And you think about that, that's probably 65% of the total votes, maybe even 70%. That's going to be uploaded. Everyone in Georgia is going to see that. In fact, everyone in the country can see that. So you get a good idea of where this race is going. But I think that's going to build trust in people, confidence, and then kind of see how their team's doing. But then the other balance that's happening today, that's going to come in with continuous feedbacks and uploads from the counties. So we'll be seeing that and it won't just be a big number here and a big number there. It's going to happen throughout the night. And like I said, we have this all done before the night is out.
What are the most common questions, complaints that are coming into the call center today?
Really just location. What about this? How do I, where do I find, like my voter page, mvp.sos.ga. You can find out where you're supposed to vote, and then just make sure that you go to the right location. Yes.
A colleague of mine heard that 2 polling sites in Gwinnett County might have been evacuated because of the bomb threat.
Yeah.
Is that true, and is it part of the Russia?
It's part of the Russian hoax. Yes.
Do you, go ahead. So do you have a total number of polling places that have been affected by this?
By the Russian hoax?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I could add it up, and we'll get that out to you.
Okay.
Will those Gwinnett County polling places stay open late?
Yeah, whenever we have a delay, even if it's like at 7 a.m. we don't start, but whenever you have a delay, an interruption like that, then it's extended by the time of the interruption, and that's just standard, procedure.
I know you talked about the Russian interference, the don't mess with Georgia. When it comes to that message that you have for people tonight, as we continue to see some of these hoaxes and non-credible threats come in, what's that message?
Well, I would tell everyone, just check with our office. We have a social media presence, and we're going to shoot you straight, give you the facts, and we get it out there as quick as we can. Because we understand how polarized America is, and we know how sometimes people want to take advantage of that, and a lot of that is foreign state actors that don't have our best, outcome in their hearts. They want to see us, mess with each other and not get along with each other. But at the end of the day, we are the United States of America. Never lose sight of that. Thank you so much. Talk to you in an hour.
Thank you, sir.
Or two.
And you just heard from Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensberger speaking on a number of things moments ago. Some of the earlier developments that we saw, including the reported bomb threat that forced an evacuation at a Gwinnett precinct, that was resolved, and then the extension to Cobb County, who got their polling locations opened 30 minutes after the 7 o'clock time. So the big thing I took away from this was the record number of turnout that we're seeing today, Tim.
The record number of early voting turnout, we already know. We talked about that extensively. 4 million Georgians have already cast their ballot. Secretary of State Raffensberger just said 700,000 Georgians have voted today since polls opened at 7 a.m. this morning. He is anticipating, I believe he said, 5.1 or 5,160,000 votes have been cast in this historic 2024 election. There's a phrase that goes something like this: when the polls close, the race for the next election actually begins. And you have to wonder if Secretary of State Brad Raffensberger is enjoying and savoring this moment, considering the fact that he and his office became such a lightning rod for controversy and allegations from former President Donald Trump, former New York City Mayor Rudy Giuliani, and more than a dozen other of his allies who were attributing or alleging that there was some election malfeasance in Georgia, and in the aftermath of how the votes were counted, and the alleged fake elector scheme in which Lieutenant Governor Burt Jones, possibly a gubernatorial candidate in less than 2 years, was a participant in. We've seen a number of plea deals that have been taken from from those individuals who were charged by Fulton County District Attorney Bonnie Willis, who's up for re-election herself tonight, have taken, and yet that case regarding the state versus Donald John Trump is still being adjudicated and awaiting a hearing in the Georgia Court of Appeals. But this has to be, if the trend holds and we continue to see what the Secretary of State is calling a very smooth, very calm, and very convenient and easy to access polling system here on November 5th, 2024, he can probably take a little bit of satisfaction that he and his office have seemingly, at least on notice, kind of redeemed itself on first notice, barring any kind of election lawsuits that may result from either side of the political spectrum.
He seems like he's in good spirits despite the little bumps that we've seen today. It's funny you mention all that's transpired this year. We had the former president report to Rice Street to turn himself into jail. I believe it was earlier this year. We've had multiple campaign stops. We've had the first presidential debate between Trump and Biden take place right here in Atlanta. Georgia has really been at the center of the political world this year and really in the past few years. It's almost, you think back on it, and today is really like the closing chapter, but also the beginning of the new chapter for politics as Georgia stands in the political world.
And let's also keep in mind that if Donald Trump is reelected president tonight to a second non-consecutive term, he is constitutionally barred from seeking a third term in 2028, meaning we will have a completely open White House contest 4 years from now on both the Democrat and the Republican side. If Kamala Harris wins and becomes the first woman of color and the first female president in our almost 250 years of history, presumably she would run for re-election, barring anything unforeseen. Most presidents do choose to seek a second term with a couple of exceptions. Theodore Roosevelt in the early 1900s and Harry Truman in the late 1940s chose not to run for a second consecutive term. But by and large, most presidents do, in which case we will see a new Republican White House nominee in 2028. Donald Trump has said this is his last political campaign, and after this he will not be on the political spectrum as an electoral option anymore, opening the door for perhaps J.D. Vance, his running mate, or several others. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, former UN Ambassador Nikki Haley, and former Governor of South Carolina Nikki Haley, several others. So what happens tonight will set the precedent not only for 2026 here in Georgia, but 2028. 26, we'll have a wide-open governor's race, wide-open lieutenant governor's race if Lieutenant Governor Burt Jones chooses not to seek the governorship. Secretary of State Raffensberger has certainly set himself up for a statewide run and a higher constitutional office. And with Brian Kemp not being able to seek a third term, he has established a national political action committee designed to steer the Republican Party toward a stance on conservative issues that he has advocated here throughout Georgia. Brian Kemp is one of the most popular governors that we've had in numerous years, right up there with his predecessor, former Governor Nathan Deal, both of whom ran relatively uncontroversial, relatively scandal-free administrations. Rumors that Brian Kemp could perhaps seek a senator seat in 2028 against the incumbent John Ossoff, or perhaps even a presidential run in 2028. And that would be just a major development and fascinating for all of us who watch and follow Georgia politics to continue to cover.
It's fair to say that we will not have a dull moment in Georgia politics here anytime soon. I want to point people right now, I know that we are getting closer and closer to 7 p.m., well, 7:30 if you live in Cobb County, as polls close and the numbers start coming in across the country. We want to make sure that you have an easy way to stay up to date with us. So you can text the word election to 470-777-9263. Again, that's 470-777-9263. And we will send you a direct link on the latest updates here in Georgia, major developments in the races that you have been following, and other information tied to tonight that you'll want to know about whether you cast your ballot or you are just looking to find out what the outcome was. We got you covered. We are going to continue our coverage with Atlanta News First News at 3, followed by another Atlanta News First Plus special from our team here starting at 7. So as we get into the final 10 minutes before we toss things to our anchors in the studio and take you out to the different counties as polling continues here in Georgia, Tim, what are you watching for most tonight, and what should those that have been following this with us all morning long, what should they expect?
Maria, I'm very interested to see whether Georgia will become the first state called in this presidential election. If everything the Secretary of State is saying is true and accurate and trustworthy, and we have confidence in it, then it's very possible that Georgia will set the tone for the rest of the election results as they come in throughout the evening. Thanks to the early voting system and thanks to the fact that our amazing voting population here in Georgia took advantage of the advanced voting option, turning out in record numbers both this year and shattering the 2022 records, which had been set at that time but are now no longer in existence. More than 4 million, or approximately 4 million, Georgia voters have already cast their ballots. We've had so far 700,000 other voters cast their ballots today. If we are to believe the Secretary of State, Georgia could well be the first, or among the first, if not the first state to announce whether or not Vice President Kamala Harris or former President Donald Trump has won this state 16 electoral votes. If that happens, I'm also very curious from a historical standpoint. I remember very distinctly in 1980 when Ronald Reagan defeated then President Jimmy Carter in a landslide, carrying 48 states to Carter's 2, Georgia and Minnesota. And in 1984, when incumbent President Reagan defeated Walter Mondale, 49 states to Walter Mondale's home state of Minnesota. The big three networks, there were only three networks at that time, ABC, NBC, and CBS, really came under a lot of fire for projecting the overall winner of those two respective elections far in advance of when the California, Oregon, Washington, Arizona, Nevada, some of the Midwestern or Central states, Mountain states, Western states, far ahead of when those polls had closed. We'll see whether or not Georgia's early results, if they do come in early, say they come in before 9 p.m., 10 p.m., even before 10 p.m., if Georgia is one of those first states to announce the results, we're going to see Georgia really setting the tone for the rest of the nights.
And just an update for all of you as we are following the developments surrounding certain precincts that have heard of reports of bomb threats. The FBI called to investigate that. We did receive this statement I want to read out to folks. The FBI, this is directly from the Federal Bureau of Investigations. Quote, the FBI is aware of bomb threats to polling locations in several states, including Georgia, many of which appear to originate from Russian email domains. None of the threats have been determined to be credible thus far. Election integrity is among the FBI's highest priorities. We will continue to work closely with our state and local law enforcement partners to respond to any threats to our elections. I wanted to make sure to get that out in front of folks because you might want to go down to your local precinct and you might hear about this, and it does sound discouraging and even scary. And so getting these updates, getting these investigators to confirm that they've done the work to look into this and they don't believe that it is credible or a safety threat to the community empowers people to then feel comfortable going down and casting their ballot.
Unfortunately, that's just an aspect of today's electoral cycle that we have to anticipate and to predict, and major kudos to the FBI for going out of their way to assure our citizenry that it is safe to go and exercise your constitutional right and your constitutional duty to cast your ballot. I remember a comment from Ben Taylor, our amazing political analyst as a professor of political science at Kennesaw State University, a conversation he and I had last week that was broadcast from the First Alert Desk here at Atlanta News First, to go out and support your local poll workers, smile at them, thank them for their hard work because they are on the true front lines of our American democratic republic, and in terms of securing and counting accurately our votes. In the aftermath of the 2020 election, there were some very incendiary comments that were directed at some Fulton County election workers. Those resulted in lawsuits that have been settled, so hopefully we can put that aspect of the election behind us. But just a word of thanks and a support, and express our own appreciation to poll workers throughout Metro Atlanta, throughout Georgia, and thanking them for their hard-working, tireless efforts. They've been at this since, I'm sure, before 7 a.m., before polls actually open. I'm not sure when poll workers are actually to report for duty, but they have to be there before 7 a.m. before all of us are able to come in and cast our ballot. So a big word of appreciation to them.
Yeah, and I was talking to our media partners at Decatur-ish earlier today, reflecting on our own voting experiences. My polling location is Fulton County, and it meant a lot to me to see the poll workers that helped me cast my ballot be excited. They were excited to be there. They were proud to help you with whatever you needed, whatever questions you had. And so it's nice to take the time and thank them and appreciate them for making today really for them to help others cast their ballot and make their voice heard.
It's wonderful to see us all come together as a voting population and a voting electorate, and remembering that, as Secretary of State Raffensberger, so in my own opinion, very eloquently said, Georgia is not the right state for anyone to pick on in terms of trying to disrupt an election, in terms of trying to intimidate the populace from one side or another. We've seen disparaging comments regarding election workers from all sides of the political spectrum, not only domestically but from foreign governments. Secretary of State Raffensberger attributed some threats to polling locations to be a part of a Russian disinformation effort to disrupt the campaign or the electoral process. So it's speaking as from the perspective of someone who has been a candidate in the electoral process, we have a special appreciation for not only candidates for public office who put themselves out there, but those who are active participants in our democratic republic.
And as we get into the final few minutes before we really get into the weeds of this election day, how polling has been going, some of the updates that we've been following, including those remarks from Secretary Brad Raffensberger, I did just want to throw it back out there to let you know that you can stay connected with us, even outside of our Atlanta News First Plus stream, and text election to 470-777-WANF. That's a fantastic resource for you to get alerts to your phone on major developments and results once polls close. Georgia is expected to have, hopes to have election numbers come in quite early.
By 8 p.m.
By 8 p.m., according to the Secretary of State. So we will, of course, be right here on Atlanta News First Plus with our team of anchors, reporters, and political analysts breaking down everything that has happened since early voting began and everything you need to know as we wait for results. Now, I also want to let you all know we do have the free Atlanta News First app that you can download on your phone and follow along for our election coverage and really the campaigns, the moments that this year has brought leading up to tonight and the voters that will be heard. I want to thank you so much for joining us here on Atlanta News First Plus, and we will now take you to Atlanta News First News at 3 with a look at how polling is going and the final hours to election night.